Chapter 751. Pei Chi brought it over, took a small sip, and then took a big gulp. Pei Huan looked at her expression and smiled. You still haven't forgotten. Pei Chi finished the wine in the glass. Pei Huan poured another glass for her. When half a bottle of wine was in Pei Chi's stomach, Pei Huan looked at it and then laughed. She felt much better, but Pei Chi was not happy either. Pei Huan called Little May to book a room in a hotel, and then they would come over to send Pei Chi there. Because Pei Chi was as drunk as a pig, she would not tell them where she was staying even if they asked. Pei Huan and Little May dragged her to the nearest 4-star hotel. Pei Huan was very regretful. Why did she get Pei Chi drunk? The moment they arrived at the hotel room, Pei Huan left Pei Chi there and left, unable to take it anymore. As she walked, she pulled her hair and complained to Little May. I should have left her in the bar. What kind of good person am I? Little May laughed at the side. Then let's drag her back. Pei Huan paused and thought for a moment. Forget it. She's as heavy as a pig. Little May smiled. Actually, Pei Huan was not as cruel as she said. They left, but forgot to close the door. In the suite, Pei Chi was lying on her stomach. Her sweater had been thrown aside, and she was only wearing a white t-shirt and jeans. Her top was rolled up to her waist, revealing a small part of her fair and slender waist. Pei Chi turned over uncomfortably. Her eyes were slightly closed, and her red lips were slightly open, exhaling an alluring breath. The lights in the room dimmed. She was completely unaware. She was only panting uncomfortably, completely unaware of how alluring she looked under the moonlight. Tang Yu exhaled with difficulty. He slowly knelt by her side, gently pressed down on her hands, and raised them high. Pei Chi opened her eyes and stared at the man above. A man? Where was she? Her head was dizzy, and her limbs were weak. She wanted to vomit, but she couldn't. Her mouth was a little stuffy. The man's scent was very familiar, so familiar that she wanted to cry. She closed her eyes, stretched out her fingers, and slowly traced his brows to his lips. She gently caressed them. Then, Pei Chi giggled. You're like my husband. Tang Yu's body trembled. He was sure that she was dead drunk. Otherwise, he wouldn't have dared to approach her. But when she said that, his heart was aching and numb. Chi, is it because you haven't forgotten me in your heart? All that happiness, just a facade? Her little hands struggled out of his grip and wrapped around his neck. She bit his chin clumsily and said in a muffled voice, Do you want me? Tang Yu's entire body stiffened. He wanted to kiss her, but he didn't want to have sex with her. No, he wanted to have sex with her crazily, but he did not know if he could still give her pleasure after not having sex for more than a year, especially when she was a little drunk. Also, when she woke up, would she think it was him? Tang Yu was in a dilemma, but the little fellow's little hands were already desperately tugging on his belt. With a hint of drunkenness in her voice, she said seductively, Can you be my brother tonight? Brother? Tang Yu's dark eyes deepened, and he could not help kissing her lips. At the same time, he pinned her little hands to his sides. Chapter 752. Pei Chi tilted her face and stretched out a hand to stroke his deep facial features. She said softly, You look like my ex-husband, but he's my brother now. She lifted her body and bit him gently. Let me tell you a secret. I slept with my brother for more than a year. Tang Yu kept looking at her with sparks in his eyes. He likes to ask me to call him brother and call him daddy when we do this kind of thing. Pei Chi giggled. She hooked her arms around his neck and kissed the corner of his lips. She murmured, Can I call you brother? Tang Yu's neck was slightly stiff. His Adam's apple kept rolling. He squinted his eyes and looked at the little thing who was so irritating. He had lost all his rationality. The belt on his shirt slipped out and the buttons were unbuttoned one by her soft and boneless hands. At this moment, he was like a miserable young man who almost surrendered in shame. They hadn't even started yet. The night was getting darker and darker. On the luxurious bed, the two of them were entangled again and again. In the end, Tang Yu leaned against her ear. His voice was hoarse. Chi-Chi, Chi-Chi. He kept saying her name, kept telling her that he missed her, but she couldn't hear him. Her body was soft and her long eyelashes were trembling. She passed out. To him, this night was a long-awaited reunion. But to the drunk Pei Chi-Chi, it was just a night of absurdity. Early in the morning, a ray of sunlight shone on Pei Chi-Chi's little face. She frowned and moved slightly. Then, she turned over. Her body was a little painful. It was as if her bones had been disassembled and reassembled. Pain? She suddenly opened her eyes wide and looked at everything around her. This place was unfamiliar. It should be a hotel room. What shocked her the most was that although the window was open, the whole room was filled with the smell of sex. Pei Chi-Chi was sleeping on her stomach. She hugged a pillow. She propped herself up slightly and realized that she was naked. The clothes were neatly folded on the bedside table, and in the trash can beside it, besides a large ball of tissues, there were also 4 t-shirts. Moreover, the amount was enough to tell that it was a strong man last night. Pei Chi-Chi stared blankly. Only then did she realize that she had really lost all her clothes last night. She screamed and ran into the bathroom with the sheet wrapped around her. Under the bright lights, she removed the bedsheet from the full-length mirror. The moment she saw Pei Chi-Chi, she covered her face. I can't look at her body anymore. There were hickeys everywhere, and that man even kissed some indescribable places in a perverted way. Pei Chi-Chi showered for a long time. She tried hard to think, but she couldn't remember when a man had done that kind of thing with her last night. Looking at the mirror, she felt a little lost. Had she also become a bad woman? Sleep with a random man? She didn't want to stay here anymore, and she didn't want to see the trash can either. She took her phone and prepared to check out. The room was registered by Pei Huan, and she used Pei Huan's ID card. The money was paid, but the waiter who was doing his rounds came back and looked at Pei Chi-Chi with a strange expression. Then, he whispered something to the receptionist. Chapter 753. Pei Chi-Chi smoothed her hair with her fingers and covered her face with it. How could that be? I live alone. She wanted to play dead. The receptionist smiled. Miss, did you have a good time last night? It wasn't that Pei Chi-Chi didn't want to pay, but she had lost her wallet and her phone. She was so drunk last night that she didn't even know where she had dropped it. She stared at the receptionist for a long time, but the receptionist was still smiling, looking very professional. In the end, Pei Chi-Chi had no choice but to call Old Kansas. Old Can drove his dazzling off-road vehicle over. With a big beard, he jumped out of the car and walked into the hotel lobby. While paying, Old Can teased Pei Chi-Chi. 4 times a night? Pei Chi-Chi wished she could dig a hole and hide in it. She stamped her feet and said, I was drunk. Drunken promiscuity is not an excuse. Old Can, on the other hand, was quite happy. When he grinned, his white teeth could be used as an advertisement for Colgate. He patted Pei Chi-Chi's shoulder hard. Good job. Good job. When he was paying, Pei Chi-Chi ran out to his car like a puff of smoke. The receptionist quickly collected the money and asked Old Can casually, Is she your girlfriend? Her boyfriend still came to pay for his girlfriend's promiscuity. He was really a good boyfriend in China. Old Can smiled. I'm her dad. As he said that, he went outside and opened the car door. His little apprentice was sitting in the passenger seat eating bread. He had just bought it. Old Can took a cigarette, lowered his head, and lit it. He took a long drag. Tell me, who slept with you? I'll kill him if I find him. Pei Chi-Chi almost choked on the bread she was eating and looked at Old Can with tears in her eyes. Old Can looked at her for a while and kindly handed her an open bottle of purified water. After she finished drinking, he looked at her again. Say something. Pei Chi-Chi continued to eat the bread. This time, she only dared to look at Old Can secretly and said honestly, I don't know. Old Can started the car and shook his head. You slept with someone you don't even know? Pei Chi-Chi froze for a moment. She was drunk, but she seemed to have a feeling that she kept calling that person Big Brother. She must be a pervert. She didn't say anything. Old Can chuckled. It's a big loss if you get drunk. You didn't even get to taste it. Pei Chi-Chi ignored him, and Lao Can continued to ask, Do you want to go to the gathering? Of course I'm going. Pei Chi-Chi replied very quickly, because Lao Can's real skills were only shown when he was collecting information. Lao Can grinned, having succeeded in his scheme. Pei Chi-Chi, aren't your legs sore? Does your back hurt? Pei Chi-Chi looked ahead and ignored him. After a while, she looked back at him suspiciously. "Master, you seem very happy." Oldkin smiled and said, "Of course. Sleeping with fresh meat makes you look more like my disciple. What if it's old bacon?" Peichichi thought for a while and was worried. "Don't tell anyone about it." Oldkin smiled. "Look at how nervous this girl was. Didn't she just sleep with a man? She should be happy. A man who used 4 teas a night wouldn't be old." On Monday, in the studio, Peichichi went to arrange the work of the crew early in the morning. After she was ready, Old Can and the relevant staff also came over. At 9 o'clock, the big star Pei Huan walked over with bags and dark circles under her eyes. She sat in front of the makeup mirror and was styled by the stylist while looking at Peichichi, who was busy beside her. In the mirror, she saw the hickey on Peichichi's neck from afar. A hickey? Chapter 754. Pei Huan smiled. Did Peichichi really lose her chastity that night? She did not say anything. When Peichichi came forward to find the angle, she said in a low voice, "Who did you sleep with that night?" That day, she had used her phone to register. Later, the hotel sent her the bill. There were 4 t-shirts. Pei Huan felt quite happy. Finally, Peichichi was no longer innocent. She had slept with a wild man. Peichichi was very indifferent. "I don't know." It was not that she was open-minded, but this kind of thing happened. It was not entirely true to say that the other party raped her. She had a vague memory of hugging that man and biting him. She still remembered that in the midst of the sharp pleasure, her nails scratched the man's chest and back, but she was beaten badly later on. He had already calmed down, but then he pressed her down and cruelly whipped her again and again. Peichichi was a little dazed. She had actually gotten some pleasure that night. That feeling was so familiar that she wanted to cry just thinking about it. Pei Huan smiled and did not say anything more. "After a while," she said softly, "don't worry, I will keep it a secret." Peichichi did not say anything. She adjusted the angle and retreated to Old Can's side. Old Can held the camera and looked at her. "Do you want to give it a try?" Peichichi was a little hesitant, so Old Can stuffed the camera into her hands. "Come, give it a try." Only then did she adjust the focal length, squinted her eyes, and snapped a few photos. She originally thought that Pei Huan would object, but Pei Huan did not. On the contrary, she was very cooperative. After taking a few photos, Peichichi showed it to Old Kansas. Old Can held a cigarette in one hand and pointed at it a few times. "Pay more attention to this angle and make up for the light over there." "Peichichi, how many times have I told you? There is no light. How can you take a picture?" Peichichi had long been used to his rough work. Pei Huan, on the other hand, sympathized with her and felt that Peichichi was living a miserable life. When they retook the photo, Pei Huan tried hard to pose for the camera. Old Can came over and scolded her. "I told you to show fashion, not posture." Pei Huan was so angry that she wanted to curse. What an old pervert. He didn't know how Peichichi could stand being with such a savage all day long. "Look at that beard. It could be a bird's nest. I don't know how to set it up." Pei Huan also lost her temper. She was the sugar daddy. Old Can did not give face to his client. He tilted his head and looked at Pei Huan. "You don't know, right? Then you should know the difference between a celebrity and a prostitute, right? The pose you put on just now was as if you were asking for a beating." Pei Huan cried from the scolding. "Run away." Little May chased after them and threatened to call their chief editor. "What should we do?" Peichichi held the camera and looked at Lao Kansas. Lao Can looked straight at his little apprentice. "Don't you know her? Didn't we drink together that night?" "I'm not going." Peichichi looked at him with disdain. Lao Can smoothed out the crumpled cigarette in his hand, lit it slowly, and said unhurriedly, "Next time, I'll give you 30%. Peichichi immediately ran over to coax Pei Huan without any restraint. The current Pei Huan was different from the previous Pei Huan. She was probably a little lonely, so she fell for Peichichi's tricks. If she knew that Peichichi was only coaxing her for the commission, she would probably vomit blood. In short, it was Peichichi who took charge of the camera afterward, because Pei Huan did not let Lao Can do it at all. Chapter 755. After 2 days of shooting, It was finally over. Pei Huan was quite satisfied with it, and only the finishing work was left. Pei Huan returned to be city first. Before she left, she met Pei Qiqi again, downstairs of Pei Qiqi's small apartment building. Pei Huan looked up at the old apartment building, pursed her lips, and coughed lightly. Pei Qiqi, you live here? Pei Qiqi nodded.
Yes.
Pei Huan leaned against the expensive white sports car and smoked another cigarette. Aren't you going to invite me up? Pei Qiqi looked down and smiled. I'm afraid you won't be used to it. Pei Huan lit the cigarette skillfully. Pei Qiqi, don't act like you're the only one who has suffered. I was much worse than you when I was at my lowest. She didn't know why she could get along with Pei Qiqi now, and she even came to see Pei Qiqi before she left. She took a breath in frustration and looked at Pei Qiqi. I'm leaving. Don't you have anything to say to me? Drive slowly, Pei Qiqi said lightly. Although Pei Huan knew that Pei Qiqi said it casually to get rid of her, she felt very happy when she heard it. She put out the cigarette, walked to the back of the car, opened the trunk, and took out 2 big boxes of flower gums. She placed them in front of Pei Qiqi. Pei Huan pretended to be disgusted. Pei Qiqi, look at you. You're as thin as a hemp stalk and pale as a ghost. You should take good care of yourself. Otherwise, no man wants to be responsible for a one-night stand. It would have been better if she hadn't mentioned it, but Pei Qiqi's face darkened. Pei Huan seemed to be very willing to mention it. For Pei Qiqi, it wasn't that she didn't care. If it were in the past, she would care a lot and couldn't accept it. But now, she was no longer someone's lover. She was more willing to forget what had happened. He had forgotten how familiar that night's aura was. He had forgotten how hot that night's temperature was. She had also forgotten about the 4 little things filled with Y and Y chromosomes. All of this was so familiar that it made her heart palpitate. So Pei Qiqi deliberately ignored it. Because the DNA test showed that she and Tang Yu had the same father, but different mothers. Under such circumstances, could he still come to H City to sleep with her? She really couldn't believe that he would sleep with his own sister. Pei Qiqi was a little stunned. Pei Huan had already moved forward and said with a smirk, Pei Qiqi, how do men other than Tang Yu taste? Pei Qiqi looked at her coldly, then turned around and walked towards her own building. Pei Huan stomped her foot. You still have such a bad temper. Even though he said that, he still picked up the tonics and stuffed them into Pei Qiqi's hands. He quickly said, don't forget to go back. Pei Huan had been very busy recently, so she couldn't always come to H City to take care of Pei Qiqi. But why would she take care of Pei Qiqi? This girl had been so cold and bad since she was young. She had a lot of bad ideas. But looking at Pei Qiqi's back, Pei Huan's eyes felt a little hot. She went back to the car, took a tissue to wipe her eyes, and drove away. Meanwhile, Pei Qiqi stood in front of the window in her room, watching the white sports car slowly drive away. She more or less understood Pei Huan's feelings, because she had nothing, just like Pei Huan. Pei Huan looked like she had everything, but she had no family or friends. How could she have friends in a Vanity Fair like the entertainment industry? Pei Huan wanted to draw some warmth from her body, or rather, to keep each other warm. Chapter 756. As Pei Qiqi stood there, she felt a little tired. The wounds that she thought had healed were all torn open with Pei Huan's arrival, and blood flowed out unseen. However, life still had to go on. She followed Old Ken to go out, collect stories, film, edit. Days passed. Occasionally, when she passed by that meet, she would go in for a drink. When she passed by the 4-star hotel, she would stand at the entrance for a long time. Some men thought she was a prostitute. On the one hand, they were stunned by her beauty, but on the other hand, they were eager to ask for the price. Pei Qiqi's gaze slowly landed on the middle-aged man's face. His face was a little red from excitement. How much? Pei Qiqi's lips moved slightly. 100 million. The man's face looked as though he had eaten shit, and he said ruthlessly, lunatic, lunatic. Pei Qiqi was still standing there, looking at the splendor of the hotel entrance. She felt a hissing pain in her heart. Was it him that night? She could check the surveillance, but she didn't. Pei Qiqi walked slowly in the bustling night, following the shadows of the trees. She told herself that it was fine. Whether it was him that night or not, she had forgotten. He didn't appear, which meant that perhaps he didn't want to appear in front of her. It was just a drunken stupor. She slowly walked further away. Where she had been standing, Tang Yu stood there, his slender body straight under the streetlight, both hands in his pockets, looking in Pei Chi-Chi's direction with a deep gaze. Then he smiled faintly. His Chi-Chi was so smart. She should have guessed that the man that night was him. She probably didn't want to admit it. Thinking of this, he felt a little bitter. In the end, she didn't want to see him again. Chi-Chi, when you thought I was your brother and we spent the night like this, did you hate me even more and look down on me even more? Tang Yu even felt a sense of inferiority in his heart. All these years, he rarely had such feelings. But when it came to Pei Chi-Chi, he couldn't help it. For more than a year, he could only look at her from afar, not daring to approach. Only that night, when he really touched her soft skin again, although he was dazzled, he still felt that she had lost weight. A woman who had given birth should be plump, but his Chi-Chi was not. Apart from the scar on her lower abdomen, she was even thinner than before and did not look like she had given birth to a child at all. God knew how much he wanted to take her back to B City that night, or even to the United States to let her see their little Tang Tang. Chi-Chi is our child. She's more than 1 year old. She can walk now. Although she can't walk steadily, she can still walk. She knew how to call mommy and daddy. Tang Yu's gaze was slightly cold under the streetlight, like a weak candle flame in the dark night, faintly burning. After a long time, he finally walked forward, following the path that Pei Chi-Chi had taken, slowly moving forward. He went down to her floor and stood there, watching her light come on. The light went on and off. She went asleep. Tomorrow, she would wake up in this humid city and rush to work. Tang Yu looked up, then leaned against the wall with a cigarette in one hand and a phone in the other, looking at the photos of her and Xiaoxin. Chapter 757. In fact, he would prefer their daughter to be called Tang Sher instead of Tang Tang. Tang Tang was a little stupid as Chi-Chi. Tang Yu's eyes softened when a huge shadow flashed in front of him. Aunt Sue came down from upstairs to take out the trash and glanced at Tang Yu. Hey, isn't this the tall, rich and handsome guy who drives a sports car? Aunt Sue looked down, but the sports car wasn't there. When she passed by, she looked at Tang Yu from head to toe. His physique looked pretty good. Who knew how many times stronger than her dead man when he was young? Auntie Sue stared at her for a long time before she asked softly, "You're looking for Miss Pei on the 4th floor, right?" Her voice carried the coquettishness of a city-age woman, but it didn't match her well-built figure. Tang Yu threw the cigarette, but on the ground, and stamped it out with his delicate calfskin shoes. He said lightly, "No." Aunt Sue's voice suddenly became more charming. "I live on the 4th floor too." "Looking for me, looking for me, looking for me." Tang Yu looked at her deeply, then turned around and left, his figure hidden under the shade of a tree. Auntie Sue was deeply insulted. She stomped her feet at Tang Yu's back. "I used to be a beauty here when I was young. Back then, my suitors lined up from one end to the other. I'm so pretty." Aunt Sue went up to the 4th floor and saw Pei Chi-Chi coming out. Aunt Sue forced a smile. "Miss Pei, are you going out on a date so late at night?" "Oh, just to print a document." Pei Chi-Chi smiled faintly and prepared to go out. She had no choice since it was a temporary task. Aunt Sue forced a smile and said indifferently, "It's not a shameful thing to go out on a date. I saw it just now. A handsome man must have a lot of tickets, right? Don't worry, Miss Pei. No one is competing with you. If I were, I would have done it already." Pei Chi-Chi didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She nodded and quickly went downstairs. She shook her head when she got downstairs and found a small pile of cigarette butts in the direction of the stairs. Pei Chi-Chi remembered Auntie Sue's words, so she squatted down and picked up a cigarette butt. That was the brand that Tang Yu often smoked. Her heartbeat quickened. He pursed his lips and looked around. There was no one around. However, there was the smell of smoke around, which meant that he hadn't gone far. Pei Chi-Chi stood up straight and looked at the dark night with a trace of sadness in her eyes. He had come, or he had always been there, out of her sight. Pei Chi-Chi pursed her lips and stood there for a long time. Then, the phone in her pocket rang. It rang, stopped, and rang again stubbornly. Only then did she pick up the call. Lao Can's voice was full of vigor. "Pei Chi, are you done? What are you waiting for?" "I'll be done in a moment. I'm looking for a printing shop." Pei Chi sounded a little absent-minded. Oldkin said something else and hung up. Pei Chi held the phone and stayed in a daze for a while. Then, she walked to a 24-hour printing shop by the roadside and quickly settled Oldkin's matter. After that, she couldn't sleep. She lay on the bed in a daze. She didn't dare to close her eyes. Once she did, she would recall the fiery memory of that night when she got drunk. Whether she remembered it or not, it was definitely 4 times. She didn't dare to recall the details. She only felt ashamed. She closed her eyes and tried hard to tell herself that it was all over. She wouldn't get drunk again, and she wouldn't roll around with Tangyu again. From the bottom of her heart, she would rather that the man that night wasn't him. Chapter 758. To everyone's surprise, Pei Huan's cover of Beauty magazine was sold out, and the magazine was urgently reprinting it. Because Pei Huan looked very fresh and natural, Pei Huan suddenly became a hot goddess among otakus. Pei Chi sat in her seat and read the magazine in her hand. Pei Huan looked like a girl on the cover, showing what she should have looked like at her age. Pei Chi looked at the cover and suddenly remembered that Pei Huan was only 22 years old, and so was she. But why did she feel that her state of mind was so old? Therefore, when taking photos of Pei Huan, she did so with a hint of nostalgia. She missed the days when she and Pei Huan were teenagers and the unhappy days. Now that she thought about it, the pain of being abused by Zhou Meilin was nothing compared to what she was feeling now. Pei Huan probably thought the same way, so she was friendly to her. Pei Chi was engrossed in watching. Behind her, Lao Can patted her shoulder heavily. "Girl, you did a good job." Since there was no one around, Oldkin lit a cigarette in the office, put it in his mouth, and sat down with his legs crossed. "You'll be in charge of private events from now on?" "What do you do, master?" Pei Chi put down the magazine in her hand and asked, looking up. Oldkin laughed. "Of course I do the props." Pei Chi felt a chill in her heart when she thought of the props that couldn't block anything. After joking around, Oldkin got down to business. "This season's magazine is selling well, and the editor-in-chief has said that we'll be having dinner tonight. The place is quite high-end, and the miser has finally plucked a feather. Comrade Pei Chi, it's all thanks to you." Then he patted her again. "Do a good job." Pei Chi looked at him and smiled faintly. After a while, she suddenly said, "Thank you, master." "Oh, so serious. I'm not used to it." Oldkin thought for a while and remembered something. "You've collected a lot of works these days, right? There will be a big photography exhibition in B City in a few days, and I recommended you." Pei Chi looked at Oldkin in a daze. "B City? What? Someone in B City will eat you?" Lao Can smiled, lowered his head to take the cigarette, and said unhurriedly. It wasn't that he was a god, but he could tell from the girl's eyes that there was a story behind her. Her accent was also B City, so he could guess it accurately. Pei Chi remained silent. "Admit defeat?" Oldkin lowered his head, almost sticking to his little disciple. He looked like he was flirting. "If you don't want to admit it, go back. If you meet an old friend, tell him that you slept with someone else in H City. You used 4 teas in one night." "That's amazing." As Oldkin spoke, he stretched out 4 rough fingers and gestured 4. The bearded man smiled, revealing his Colgate teeth. Pei Chi pulled his hand down. "Don't say another word." Just as Oldkin was about to say something, a few colleagues walked in from outside, and when they saw them, they froze. "Wow, Oldkin has taken a fancy to the new intern?" She didn't seem to be his cup of tea. Oldkin liked women who were tender and slutty. They had big waists and looked like snake spirits. His colleagues giggled and wanted to leave. Oldkin blew his beard and glared at them. "You little brats, why are you going out?" "I'm teaching my disciple." "What are you thinking?" Although he said it so fiercely, Oldkin's face turned red. Pei Chi made a sound of acknowledgement and said very innocently, "I was just asking Oldkin about kissing techniques." Chapter 759. Oldkin's face darkened. This little girl dared to insult him. However, Old Can didn't say anything. He even leaned over and kissed Pei Chi-Chi's forehead. You've learned well. This time, it was Pei Chi-Chi's turn to be dumbfounded. Did they still trust each other? Old Can was in a good mood. He turned around and gestured again. Don't forget to have dinner tonight. After he left, those few ran around Pei Chi-Chi and chattered. Chi-Chi, are you really with Old Can? Pei Chi-Chi's eyes fell on the computer screen and she began to focus on retouching the photos. Hearing the question, she turned around. Old Can is like the slippers in the public bathroom. Are you sure I will wear them when I take a shower? They touched their noses and silently sympathized with Old Can, who was compared to a slipper for 3 seconds. Pei Chi-Chi continued to retouch the photos happily. After a while, the phone on the table rang. It was Pei Huan. After thinking for a moment, she picked up the phone. Pei Huan's voice was soft. Chi-Chi, have you seen the magazine? Pei Chi-Chi nodded. She was a little touched. It seemed that Pei Huan had never been so polite to her before. After getting Pei Chi-Chi's affirmation, Pei Huan's voice became even softer. She was like a little sheep. I'm going to fly to C City in 2 days. I can reach H City. Let's have a meal. Pei Chi-Chi was silent. Pei Huan waited for a long time but didn't see anyone. If it were someone else, she would have been angry. But this was Pei Chi-Chi, so she said gently, It's okay in your small room. I remember that your cooking is very good. I'm not picky, Chi-Chi. Pei Chi-Chi didn't know whether to laugh or cry. When did Pei Huan become so intimate with her? She tried to keep a cold face and voice. If it's because of the photo shoot, you don't have to do this. It's my job. If it's for personal reasons, you don't have to do this. Pei Huan was stunned. She didn't expect Pei Chi-Chi to reject her so mercilessly. Actually, she had thought about it later. The reason why she saw Pei Chi-Chi like this was because, at her most helpless moment, Pei Chi-Chi had asked Tang Yu to save her, not caring about her life or death. Also, she felt guilty. It was only right and proper for the Pei group to return to her name, but she didn't know why, but she felt a little guilty. It was just like the child that Pei Chi-Chi had raised for a long time was stolen by her. Now that she was in this state, she more or less wanted to make up for it. In addition, she was lonely. Other than her manager, Xiaomei, no one treated her well from the bottom of their hearts. Pei Huan had been here for a long time and was somewhat tired of it. She didn't lack money or resources, but she lacked love. Those men only wanted her body, they couldn't give her love. When she saw Pei Chi-Chi, who she hadn't seen for a long time, she was like a person who had been sick for a long time grabbing hold of the last life-saving herb. She held on desperately, but Pei Chi-Chi didn't want her. Pei Huan was quite disappointed and didn't speak for a long time. Pei Chi-Chi listened to the breathing on the other side of the phone and said softly, If there's nothing else, I'll hang up. Pei Huan said anxiously, Pei Chi-Chi, you still look down on me and hate me, don't you? After saying that, she waited quietly. Pei Chi-Chi sighed in her heart for Pei Huan's childishness. Pei Huan wasn't like this in the past. It was probably because she really didn't have any relatives around her, so she treated her as a mother. But Pei Huan was actually 1 or 2 months older than her. Chapter 760. Pei Huan felt as if she had eaten honey and continued to pester her. Chi-Chi, is it true? Pei Chi-Chi was speechless. Pei Huan, you're so childish. Then she hung up. But Pei Huan didn't mind. Not at all. Pei Chi-Chi must love her, otherwise she wouldn't praise her like that. She hung up slowly and looked at Xiaomei. Am I cute? Xiaomei was also speechless. But she felt sorry for Pei Huan, who was like a puppy wagging its tail at the sight of a bone, obviously lacking love. Xiaomei had been with Pei Huan for a long time. In fact, Pei Huan wasn't too bad, except a little willful. She was much better than some of the coquettish bitches in the entertainment industry. Xiaomei also knew about their past. She sighed and told the truth. Miss Pei probably didn't want to think about the past since she was able to hide in H City. I don't think you'll be welcomed if you go up like this. Pei Huan looked at Xiaomei, her heart cold. On the other side, Pei Chi-Chi hung up the phone. She and Pei Huan couldn't be sisters, not in the past, not now. She stared at the computer for a long time and couldn't complete a picture. Fortunately, The editor-in-chief came out and told her about the dinner tonight, so she forced herself to be alert. The editor-in-chief spent a lot of money and picked a very high-end restaurant in H City. Except for more than 30 people from the magazine, there were only a few customers. And tonight's theme was a candlelight dinner, so they were having a good time. Laucan had drunk too much and fell into the editor-in-chief's arms. The editor-in-chief pushed him aside to cool off. The later it was, the better the atmosphere was. Besides, Laucan was asleep, so there was no one to protect Pei Chichi. Everyone kept pestering her, giving Pei Chichi two choices. One was to kiss Laucan, the other was to put out the candle and grab someone to kiss, so perverted. Pei Chichi covered her hot cheeks, a little drunk. Even a pervert has to be kissed. There was a rhythmic noise around. Pei Chichi was in a dilemma. She looked at Laucan, who was sleeping like a dead pig, and kicked him. There was still no response. Pei Chichi gave up. I choose to grab a random person. She didn't want to be poked with a mouthful of hair, so she put her palms together again. When the time comes, I'll find a girl to kiss. The candles were extinguished one by one, and the young man began to lead the rhythm. Kiss, kiss. Pei Chichi had no choice. She was surrounded by darkness and couldn't see anything. She walked slowly, feeling her way, and never caught hold of anyone. The girls laughed and avoided her. Pei Chichi made a few turns, and her fingers touched a warm body. It's a man? She froze for a moment, took a step back, and cleverly decided to say that she had kissed him. But before she could say anything, her little mouth was kissed. The other party's lips were burning hot and glued to hers. While she was stunned, he opened her little mouth and went straight in. He teased her nimbly, and he knew how to make her happy. The man's cheek was even pressed against hers, and he held the back of her head with one hand and her waist with the other. Her whole body was pressed against his. That kind of warmth, that kind of breath. She was being kissed, and her tears were flowing. It was Tang Yu. She closed her eyes, raised her hand, and slapped his face with a loud slap. Many people had vaguely seen them kissing and were screaming excitedly. Chapter 761. The scene was silent. Everyone was shocked by the sound of the slap. Oh my God, did Pei Chichi get hit? Or did Pei Chichi hit someone? Someone carefully lit a lamp. In the dim light, she could only see Pei Chichi standing face to face with a man who was so handsome that even the heavens would be enraged. That scene was truly very, very beautiful. Who are you? Amy asked in a low voice. What's your relationship with Pei Chichi? Hey, I saw it. It was Pei Chichi who hit someone. There were 5 finger marks on the handsome man's face. Looking at the entanglement in their eyes, there was definitely an adulterous look. A living love-struck man and woman. Almost at the same time, Tang Yu and Pei Chichi spoke. Ex-husband, brother and sister. Ex-husband? Brother and sister? What a lot of information. The onlookers felt particularly excited. Even Old Can narrowed his eyes. Old Can, are you jealous? The main character is here. The chief editor smiled wickedly and looked at the love-struck man and woman. After a while, her delicate body trembled. Damn, isn't that Mr. Tang? The top celebrity of B City. The richest of the rich. He actually had an adulterous look with their magazine's Pei Chichi. The chief editor looked at Pei Chichi as if she was the superstar of South Africa, full of love. On the other side, Tang Yu frowned and looked at Pei Chichi. When did they become brother and sister? The people around quietly retreated, leaving the space for them. And the chief editor was even more witty. He did not pay. Anyway, with the star of South Africa, he could play again next time if he kept the funds. Only the two of them were left at the scene. Pei Chichi looked up, tears slowly falling from her eyes. She told herself not to cry. It was not worth it. But she could not help it. Her heart was in so much pain that it was unbearable. She raised her head, gave him another slap, and turned to leave. Her arm was caught. She could not leave. Tang Yu didn't say anything. He just grabbed her. Except for the night when she was drunk, they had never been this close, face to face, and she had slapped him. And he understood, more or less, that it was because of that night. In her heart, they were brother and sister, and he had slept with her again. Mr. Tang, let go. Pei Chi-Chi's voice was low and hoarse, with a suspicious nasal sound. Since it's been so long, why did you still appear? Tang Yu held her, his deep eyes gazing at her profile, but he still didn't make a sound. Pei Chi-Chi struggled, but to no avail. Her emotions had reached a peak. She turned around and stared at him with tears in her eyes. There was a sneer on her lips. Or does Mr. Tang have a special hobby? You like to sleep with your own sister? He called her name painfully, Chi-Chi. She took a few steps back and sneered. You disgust me. With that said, she took a few steps forward. This time, he hugged her from behind. Tang Yu's face rested in the crook of her neck, and he didn't say a word. He missed her. He missed her very, very much. So many nights, so many times, he followed behind her, stood below her building, and could only look at her silently. He fantasized about hugging her, even if it was just for a second. That night was an accident. If he hadn't tasted it again, he would probably have been able to keep his composure and not rush out like a young boy tonight, just because Pei Chi-Chi might be kissing another man. Mr. Tang, aren't you afraid that you won't be able to explain to your fiancé if there's a scandal? Pei Chi-Chi looked up, closed her eyes, and said cruelly. Chapter 762. Tang Yu's body froze then. He slowly let go of her. Just when Pei Chi-Chi thought that he was going to let go of her, her waist suddenly tightened, and she fell into the warm embrace of a man. As he hugged her, his dark eyes were burning like the brightest blue fireworks in the night sky, deep and quiet. It was as though he was going to explode at any moment. She was restrained by him and glared at him angrily, her whole body trembling. At this moment, anger and humiliation washed through all her senses. She heard herself asking sharply, Mr. Tang, are you so hungry that you can't be choosy? She must have provoked him, as all his tolerance turned into anger. He lowered his head and kissed her on the lips. He kissed her passionately, deeply and forcefully, as though it was the last time in the world. Cupping her tiny face with both hands, he pinched her chin to prevent her from biting it. He kissed her deeply, clinging onto her, refusing to let her bite down on him. He kissed her deeply, clinging onto her. Pei Chi-Chi's body stumbled backward, then backward, until he finally hit the wall. Their bodies were pressed against each other. Even after that night, her body was still incredibly sensitive after a year. They both sighed because of the contact, and they were on the verge of exploding. He kissed her, but he was no longer as rough as before. He gently kissed the corner of her mouth, kissing away her embarrassment. Pei Chi-Chi seemed to have come back to her senses as she started to struggle again. However, she couldn't avoid his kisses on her neck and behind her ears. If he kissed there, she would melt into a puddle of water and be at his mercy. They had done it countless times. He knew her weakness very well and knew how to make her melt. Pei Chi-Chi raised her head and was kissed wantonly by him. She was embarrassed and angry at the same time. She balled her hands into fists and hammered his shoulders. She was like a desperate little beast struggling for its life. The pleasure in her body was especially clear and magnified by countless times because they had been apart for so long. Just being kissed by him like this made her body burn up. Her legs quietly curled up, but her heart was cold. How could anything happen between her and Tang Yu? Pei Chi-Chi's eyes were filled with sorrow. Tears flowed down her cheeks and flowed down her neck. Tang Yu tasted the salty taste, and all of a sudden, he froze. She was crying. She cried under his kiss, under his touch. His tall and broad body was unbelievably stiff. He slowly paused, then lifted his eyes and looked at her. Her face was covered in tears, especially her eyes, which made people's hearts tremble. Tang Yu clumsily reached out his fingers to wipe the tears from the corners of her eyes. At this moment, he was at a loss, like a child who had done something wrong. Pei Chi-Chi supported herself and looked up at him. Under the dim light, they stared at each other, but they could not go back. "Let me go. Leave me," she whispered. Her head pressed hopelessly against the wall. Tang Yu was still pressing against her. His body moved a little, but he did not let go. She slapped him again and turned his face to the side. His handsome face was a little red, but he did not make a sound. He turned his head and continued to look at her with that deep gaze. Just looking at her like this was already heaven for Tang Yu. So many times, he could only follow her from afar and look at her from afar. Pei Chi looked back stubbornly and slapped him again. Chapter 763. Actually, it wasn't that nobody was there. The waiters and cashiers were hiding under the counter, asking, "Do you think he will kiss her again?" I dare say that if the female lead dares to hit him again, the male lead will kiss her again. Then, will they do a real exercise here? The one who was worried earlier asked. It's fine. The reason why the male lead can be called the male lead is because he is so strong that he can shatter all the utensils in the restaurant. That's awesome. Did you see that? The watch on the male lead's hand is worth at least 1 or 2 million. So, it wasn't a big deal. The main thing was that the male lead felt good. They were discussing in hushed voices. On the other side, Pei Chi-Chi's tears fell again. She slapped him again. Wow, she slapped him again. So exciting. The few of them covered their faces and peeked. Tang Yu's pretty face was slapped a few times. His gaze turned deep as he lowered his head slightly. His slender fingers caressed her face slowly. His voice was low and deep. Pei Chi, you dare to hit me like this because I love you. Don't insult me, Mr. Tang. You make me sick. Pei Chi glared at him with a small flame in her eyes. Tang Yu's gaze deepened. His fingers paused and pinched her little chin. His thin lips pressed against her lips, and his voice was sent into her little mouth. It's disgusting, but you enjoy it very much. Once again, he kissed her thoroughly. She struggled with all her might, but she couldn't break free. This pervert. Pei Chi-Chi's body was pressed tightly against him. There were no blind spots or gaps. Moreover, their lips and tongues were entangled, and the sounds they made were extremely embarrassing. The waiters were enjoying themselves. Wow, it was so intense. It was much more exciting than on TV. Moreover, they could really feel the male lead's masculine hormones. It was as if he was going to tear the female lead's clothes apart in the next second and have a delightful rape scene. However, this was all in their imagination. Tang Yu's kiss gradually became gentle. He licked and kissed the corner of her mouth and her neck as if he was comforting her. No matter what, he couldn't have wanted her in such a situation. That night, under the cover of alcohol, darkness, and her lack of sobriety, neither of them mentioned that night. That night was a taboo between them. When they were sober, he couldn't use his brother's identity to sleep with her. Finally, he let go of her lips and took a step back. Pei Chi struggled to stand up straight. She looked at him. Then, she picked up her things and ran towards the door. Tang Yu stood there and looked at her back before he slowly chased after her. He was stopped in front of the counter. "Sir, you haven't paid yet. Tonight's bill is 37,000 yuan. Tang Yu threw a card down. The password is the last 6 digits. With that, he left. Pei Chi had already walked about 100 meters away. Tang Yu followed her and reached out to hail a taxi. However, it was rush hour, and no car was willing to take her. Pei Chi walked for about 100 meters. Tang Yu followed. She reached out to hail a taxi, but it was rush hour. No taxi was willing to take her. Under the dim yellow streetlights, Pei Chi stopped to hail a taxi after walking for a while. Then, she gave up and continued walking. Chapter 764. That night, the sky was filled with snowflakes, and it was very sweet. That night, she hugged him and said, "I only like Tang Yu." That night, she called him Daddy. She was singing on his back, forcing him to sing better. "Actually, Chi, your singing is really terrible." Tang Yu was wearing a thin windbreaker and looked very charming. Following behind a beautiful girl like that, they naturally became a scenery. Slowly, people started to look at them secretly, and then they started to look at them openly. Tang Yu didn't care, but Pei Chi couldn't stand it anymore and turned around, and he walked slowly to her. Chi-Chi, are you tired? Her nose felt a little sore. She was very tired, not physically, but mentally. She looked up at him from the street. Her eyes reflected the bright lights of City H and the past that had nothing to do with him. Tangyu, don't follow me anymore. She looked at him calmly, but there was a deep sadness in her eyes. It's impossible for us to be together. If it's possible, you won't abandon our child. At that time, she begged him so much that she didn't even care if they were related by blood. She just wanted to be with him. But he didn't want it, didn't want her, and didn't want their child. What am I to you now? Am I just a concubine under your marriage with Shenlian? A sneer appeared on Pei Chi-Chi's pale face. Do you want me to do that? Do you want me to be with you and not be able to see the light of day for the rest of my life? Isn't that right? Tang Yu's lips moved. He wanted to say that he and Shenlian weren't married. But now, if he said such words, it would be pale and powerless, and even more despicable. He looked at her for a long time and finally sighed. I'll send you back. No. She was at the peak of her emotions and took 2 steps back. No, Tangyu. Leave me. Give up on me. Actually, she had given up on him long ago. Wasn't her face hurting now? In this life, she would never be his younger sister, let alone his shameful mistress. No matter how bad Pei Chi-Chi was, she didn't want to love the murderer of her child. Yes, the murderer. There was an unconcealable hatred in her eyes. That hatred was like a knife that pierced into Tang Yu's heart. Tang Yu looked at her with a look of pain on his face. His muscles twitched slightly, and the strength in his body seemed to be sucked away. He just looked at her, his eyes hiding a hint of pain. What did she think of him? Just a jerk and a pervert who wants to sleep with his own sister. Tang Yu chuckled and leaned against a tree. He took out a cigarette and lit it. After taking a long drag, he looked at her again. Pei Chi-Chi's body was a little stiff as she stood there. Her little face had the stubbornness that he was familiar with. Tang Yu got up and said, I'll send you back. He didn't know how long the stalemate lasted. Eventually, she walked in front and he followed behind. They walked under the moonlight, one in front and the other behind. They couldn't hold hands anymore, and he couldn't piggyback her anymore. She stuck close to his back and sang terrible songs into his ears. Finally, he reached the apartment building where she lived. It was almost midnight. Pei Chi-Chi felt as though her legs were about to break. She didn't know how she managed to persevere. She paused for a moment, turned around at the staircase and looked at Tang Yu. I'm here. He held the cigarette and leaned against the wall. He nodded and didn't say anything. Chapter 765. Yes, many times. Tang Yu looked at her. His eyes were deep and unfathomable under the moonlight. Pei Chi-Chi pursed her lips. She did not say anything and went upstairs. Tang Yu stood there, looking up at her slowly disappearing figure at the top of the stairs. The only thing that accompanied him was the long night and the small stick of cigarette between his fingers. Pei Chi-Chi went upstairs. She stood in front of the window and looked out. Tang Yu was still standing there, with no intention of leaving. Beside her, a black sports car stopped slowly. Pei Chi-Chi put down the curtains, turned on the lights, and took her clothes to take a shower. She stood under the warm water, feeling the hot water wash over her. She looked up, closed her eyes, and felt her body trembling slightly. Whenever she thought of that night, she would feel guilty. That was her older brother. When she came out, she wrapped herself in a bathrobe and dried her hair. Then, she went to the window and lifted a corner of the curtain to take a careful look. He was still there. Tang Yu probably felt her gaze as he looked in her direction. Pei Chi-Chi put down the curtain and stood there quietly for a while before leaning against the headboard. There was a book by the bedside. She picked it up and read it quietly. It was a fairy tale. She had flipped through this book countless times. She would read it every night when she was pregnant. She remembered that sometimes when she was telling the story, the little one in her stomach would squirm, as if it was very happy. She had really felt the existence of that child. Suddenly, she had lost her child and had an older brother. Pei Chi-Chi closed her eyes, and a cold smile appeared at the corner of her lips. What did she want her brother to do? She had never gotten what she wanted that night. Pei Chi did not sleep well. She woke up in the middle of the night because it was raining outside. She lay on the bed for a long time, listening to the dripping of the autumn rain outside. She got up mechanically and opened the curtains. A cool breeze blew on her face. On the street, in the drizzle, that figure was still standing there. It was a little stubborn, a little lonely, and a little, indescribable heartache. Tang Yu raised his head and looked at her. In the darkness, their eyes met. Although they were quite far apart, they were so familiar with each other. The darkness of the night really couldn't block anything. She looked at him in that way, and then slowly closed the curtains. Leaning against the window, she looked up and told herself that Pei Chi did not need to look anymore. It was all in the past. Whether it was love or hate, he had forgotten everything. Yes, forgetting was the best ending. She did not go back to sleep. Instead, she went to the kitchen to clean up and make herself some supper. However, a bowl of shredded chicken noodles was placed in front of him. Pei Chi stared blankly. Her eyes were a little warm, and her tears fell into the bowl, but she did not move. She just stood there, letting the tears fall, letting the wound open. Again and again, she squatted down, hugged herself with her arms, and cried softly. She wanted to tell herself that it was okay, and that everything would be fine. However, she could not stop crying no matter how hard she tried. The next day, her eyes were as swollen as walnuts because of her poor sleep and crying. She wore a grass-green skirt and a white knitted coat. She carried her camera bag downstairs. Tang Yu stood beside the car and looked at her deeply. "Have you had breakfast?" Pei Chi looked at him indifferently. She did not say anything and walked to the bus stop in front. Chapter 766. Tang Yu paused for a moment. Pei Chi didn't say anything more and walked quickly to the bus stop. Her eyes felt a little warm, but she didn't regret it. Perhaps she hated him from the bottom of her heart. Even if that child shouldn't exist, it was their child, and it was already 7 months old. Just because he didn't agree, it was gone. When the bus arrived, she didn't turn back to look at him. When she arrived at the magazine office, she received a lot of caring gazes the moment she entered. This was especially so for Amy, who examined Pei Chi from head to toe. She grunted loudly and said, "Your glabella is black, your face is blurry, and your eyes are swollen like walnuts. Tell me, how many times did you fool around last night?" Pei Chi sat in front of her desk and said calmly, "Did I? Unfortunately, no. Come on." Amy certainly wouldn't give up. She winked at her. "Is it your boyfriend? Or your ex-boyfriend? If you've reconciled, bring him to meet us so that we can take advantage of him." The main thing was that she could tell that the man was an elite, and when he stood together with Pei Chi, they looked like a couple. Moreover, the electricity in their eyes and the compatibility of their kisses showed that they didn't have a pair of eyes. Pei Chi squeezed out a smile. "We broke up, so there's no more advantage." Amy still wanted to say something, but Oldkin came over. "Pei Chi, the managing editor is looking for you." He helped Pei Chi out of the awkward situation. Amy and the others looked as though they wouldn't let her go once she returned. Pei Chi felt a little helpless and got up to follow Old Kansas. She breathed a sigh of relief. "Thank you, Master." Oldkin showed his white teeth. "Firstly, the managing editor is really looking for you. Secondly, I also want to get first-hand news." Pei Chi glanced at him. "This is the gigolo that you can't forget in City B?" Oldkin patted her on the shoulder. "He's not bad-looking. Is he good?" Pei Chi almost choked and stared at Old Can with tears in her eyes. "What's there to be embarrassed about? As artists, we should appreciate the most beautiful things in the world. The combination of the soul and the flesh is the most beautiful, right?" At this moment, Pei Chi was already standing at the door of the chief editor's office. She glanced at Lao Can and said, "It'll be perfect if you add in the RMB. As expected of my teacher." Old Can was thick-skinned. Just like his beard, it was bottomless. Pei Chi knocked on the door and entered. Lao Can threw an expression at her, indicating that she should come out first. Pei Chi would never talk to him about it. When he entered, The chief editor was sitting there smoking and deep in thought. He seemed to be thinking about something. He looked up at Pei Chi, and a smile started to spread from the end of his facial features. The change in his expression was also quite delightful, and Pei Chi was flinched. The chief editor's face was full of smiles. He put out the cigarette in his hand and said to himself, "Girls don't like to smoke. Let's talk after I put it out." Pei Chi was flattered by such respect. When she came in before, when did the chief editor not make the office as smoky as the scene of a fire? The chief editor put out the cigarette and continued with a smile. "The company above us is very optimistic about our magazine and is preparing to set up a commune in City B. It's always a little difficult at the beginning." Pei Chi listened carefully and did not say anything. Chapter 767. Thinking that his words carried no weight and might not sound particularly pleasant, the managing editor continued to praise him. "Of course, little Pei, most young people are not as pragmatic and talented as you. Most young people are still frivolous and impetuous. They always think that they are very impressive and that they can rise to the top in one step without working hard. Becoming a regular employee in just a month." Feeling that he had gone too far, the managing editor pulled the topic back. He spoke softly, slowly, earnestly, and indescribably gently. "Anyway, I think little Pei is very good. I also strongly recommended you to the higher-ups to become a regular employee. You know, there is only one spot among the 4 interns in this batch. I have high hopes for you." Pei Chi was not a fool. She had already heard the signs from the managing editor's previous words. Now that he was talking to her about becoming a regular employee, she had a very bad feeling. However, the older, the wiser. The managing editor began to reminisce about the past. "Little Pei, we are establishing a branch and we are in need of manpower. At this difficult time, I believe that with your excellence, you will definitely not abandon our club, right?" Previously, Pei Chi had been thinking of making arrangements for her funeral, but now it was hard for her to do so. The managing editor swiftly took out a contract from the drawer. "If you don't have any objections, let's sign the contract first. That would be fairer to you. Little Pei, I really think highly of you. It's rare to see a talented young man like you." Pei Chi secretly wanted to vomit. The managing editor had never said such sweet words before. When he was angry, he would rush into the editing department, clench his fists, and roar. "What kind of damn article is this? Do you still want to work? This kind of thing is more like wiping people's buttocks." But now, he was speaking so softly, like a spring breeze. Was this still the managing editor? "Managing editor, I feel that the opportunity should be given to more outstanding people." Pei Chi also began to play Tai Chi, however. How could she be a match for the managing editor? The managing editor smiled. "Chi, in my heart, you are the most outstanding." Pei Chi looked at him. He also looked at Pei Chi, smiling. Pei Chi looked at the contract on the table and said calmly, "I don't want to go to B City. For now, I promise." The editor-in-chief said earnestly, "Now, the magazine company needs a business backbone like you, little Pei. You are also Old Can's proud disciple. I believe you because of Old Kansas. You probably don't know this, but Old Can has said many times that he is not worried about you retouching the pictures." Pei Chi cursed in her heart. Lao Can must be satisfied with those snake spirits that she had cultivated. The managing editor looked at her. "Besides, we really need people. Especially young people with dreams, talent, and drive." Pei Chi said weakly, "Chief editor, I don't have any dreams. That's why I said, little Pei, you're pragmatic." The managing editor continued, "We young people have to be pragmatic. We can't be unrealistic." Pei Chi looked at the situation. The managing editor would not let her go if she did not sign the contract, so she said lightly, "I'll sign it, but I will only be in B City for a year. After a year, I will request to be transferred back to H City." In fact, it was the same no matter where she was. She was in H City. Wouldn't Tangyu be able to find her? That's right. The managing editor smiled happily. That's right. Little Pei, you have a bright future in our magazine company. Chapter 768. Pei Chi knew that this was all because of Old Kansas. But when she thought of Old Can, she remembered that she would no longer be his disciple when she went to be city in the future. She was somewhat at a loss. In fact, she was somewhat used to hanging out with Lao Kansas. Lao Can's rough appearance gave her a sense of security. Even some of his rough words had a different taste, making her forget that B City was another world. And now, she was going back to that world. She was at a loss. Pei Chi walked out in a daze and ran into Old Can at the door. Old Can was leaning against the wall, smoking. When he saw Pei Chi come out, he smiled and said, "How is it? Are you trapped?" He could see that the chief editor's gaze was strange yesterday. He looked at this girl as if he was looking at a gold mine. When he went back, he did a search and found a big shot in B City. Tangyu. He didn't expect his little disciple to have a past with such a man. The chief editor's motive was too obvious. How could this girl win against a 1,000-year-old fox? The chief editor must have gotten his way by now. Pei Chi glanced at Old Can and didn't say anything. Old Can smiled and put out his cigarette. As expected, Pei Chi was sad. "Do you want me to go that much?" "Why? You can't bear to leave Master?" Old Can stroked her hair. "Sigh. Why do I feel like you're a child who's about to be weaned? I can't bear to see you." Pei Chi spat out a mouthful of blood inwardly. Old Can really has a heavy taste. Old Can stroked Pei Chi's hair as if he were a pet. Pei Chi's head almost shrank, and she said vaguely, "I can't bear to leave Master's private work." She thought about going back to B City alone without any private work. Life would be much tighter than before. Old Can was still smiling. "Don't worry, Master won't leave you. Master knows a lot of people in B City." Pei Chi looked surprised. "Master, will you die of exhaustion?" Old Can glared at her. Pei Chi imitated the chief editor and smiled. "Master, you are energetic and talented." Lao Can touched his nose. "Pei Chi, why do you feel like your skin is itching?" Pei Chi still ran away with a smile on her face. Lao Can looked at her back and laughed. "This damn child." He smoked a cigarette and looked into the distance. Many people had hidden scars in their hearts that no one knew about. The little girl was like that, and so was he. After Pei Chi signed the contract, the chief editor announced the people who would go to B City with him this time. Amy was the first one. Her home was in H City, so she was unwilling to go to B City. "Why do you want to go there?" "She's already one of the best in H City's beauty magazine." Amy tidied up the boxes on the table. "If it wasn't for the fact that it's only for a year, I'd rather resign than go." Another colleague who didn't want to go was a little envious. "Silly, many celebrities are now buying houses and settling down in B City. Do you think that H City is still a trendsetter? Everyone is fighting for a popular starlet now. Do you still expect her to fly to H City? Did she think that everyone was just a pretty face like Pei Huan?" Amy actually knew this, but she was still unhappy. Pei Chi quietly tidied up her things. Finally, she picked up her camera. Chapter 769. Pei Chi knew that the main reason she didn't leave Jiaran was because of Old Kansas. Not for anything else, but for the warmth that Old Can gave her. Old Can was standing at the door. He walked over and wrapped up his beloved disciple's things, labeled them, and sent them to the express delivery. Amy looked at Old Can, then at Pei Chi, and winked. "Old Can is really good to you. Won't you reconsider?" Pei Chi smiled. "Forget it," Amy said thoughtfully. "I think you still like the pretty boy from that day." "I used to like him, but not anymore," Pei Chi said softly after a moment of surprise. However, Amy found a trace of pain in her eyes that was carefully hidden. Amy looked at her for a while and coughed lightly. "Pei Chi, you really are a child with a story." Pei Chi just smiled. No one would want to hear that kind of story because it was too sad. Later, the magazine staff had another gathering. This time, they went to eat first and then went to KTV afterwards. Under the dim light, Amy sang with all her might. Pei Chi was stunned. A colleague at the side said that Amy had fallen out of love because she had to go to B City for a year. Broke up just like that? Pei Chi didn't understand. The last day in H City was spent in a heart-wrenching atmosphere. The next day, all of the employees went to the airport with dark circles under their eyes. Pei Chi sat next to Old Can, who was like a chicken protecting its chicks. He moved his sleeping disciple's head to his shoulder. His shoulders were wide, so it was more comfortable. Looking at that calm little face, Old Can's eyes flickered. Actually, it wasn't entirely because he liked this lass's temperament, but because this lass was really smart. She could immediately understand whatever he said. He had taught many disciples, but none of them could withstand his scolding for 3 days. In just an hour, the plane landed at the B City airport. Under the lead of the chief editor, the group got off the plane happily and walked to the exit to find a ferry. Someone from the club had already arrived and booked a 3-star long-term hotel. However, Lao Can was not one of them. Lao Can spent a lot of money to rent the most luxurious apartment in B City, the kind where he could see the entire B City's night view. He put his hand on Pei Chi-Chi's shoulder and took her away. "Girl, let's live together. Who wants to live with you?" Pei Chi-Chi snorted. Old Can paused and placed a key in her hand. "This is the key. Our rooms are facing each other, but I live in a 160 square meter apartment, and you live in a 40 square meter apartment. The rent is $13,000 a month, and I'll pay for it. Does this count as cohabitation? Does it count as keeping?" Pei Chi took the key. Yes. She reached out and hugged Old Can affectionately. "Master, you're the best." Therefore, chatting with Old Master was a very satisfying thing. Old Can's bearded face was full of disdain as he looked at the little koala who was clinging to him. "You're so weak. Next time when you eat meat with me, don't be too stingy and bring shame to me. If word gets out, I won't acknowledge you as my disciple." Pei Chi hugged his arm. She and Old Can had a relationship that transcended gender. Both of them knew that he doted on her like a little daughter, and Pei Chi lacked a father's love. Tang Yuan was the one with the DNA, but Old Can gave her a sense of security. Chapter 770. The atmosphere suddenly froze. Pei Chi was still holding Lao Can in her arms, while Tang Yu was next to Shunlian. The surroundings seemed to be still. No one made a sound and waited for Tang Yu's reaction. At this moment, Shunlian, who was next to Tang Yu, put her hand in Tang Yu's arm, smiled and said, "Let's go." Tang Yu didn't move. His eyes were still on Pei Chi-Chi's little face, as if they were glued to each other. Shunlian followed his gaze and also fell on Pei Chi-Chi's face. There was a provocative smile in her eyes. In the crowded airport, Pei Chi felt a strong malice. "Is this the toy boy?" Lao Can's voice was rough. Pei Chi didn't say anything. Lao Can knew that he had guessed right. Generally speaking, he would never talk about things that he had to do. Old Kinjiang swept Pei Chi into his bosom with his palm leaf fan-like big palm. He was tall and big, so Pei Chi looked like a little chick in his bosom, but strangely, he fit in well with him. "Let's go." Lao Can held his little girl in one hand and pushed the luggage with the other. The combination was like a beauty and a beast. It attracted a lot of attention. Pei Chi struggled subconsciously, but Lao Can's voice rang in her ear. "If you don't want to cry, smile for them." Pei Chi forced a smile at Lao Can's. Lao Can looked at her for a long time and gave up. "Forget it. Don't smile. It's uglier than crying." In the end, he simply held her waist with one hand, put her on the suitcase, and pushed her away. Pei Chi held his arm and looked up. Her voice was particularly soft. "Where are we going?" "Take a taxi. Go home," Lao Can said in a particularly masculine manner. He pushed her like a child, which attracted a lot of attention, and some people even took photos. Lao Can put on his sunglasses and looked imposing. Xinlian tilted her head to look at Tang Yu and sneered. "See? This is the woman you have been longing for. Tang Yu already has someone else." She saw it clearly. Pei Chi and the bearded man were definitely not faking it. That kind of tacit understanding and that kind of expression was definitely not possible without at least a year. Tang Yu broke away from her hand without any expression on his face. He walked forward, and Xiao Ran followed closely behind. Xun Lian stood there, still smiling strangely. It's only been a year since she lost your child, and she's already with another man. Tang Yu, it turns out that your baby doesn't care about you that much. Tang Yu ignored her and disappeared into the elevator. Originally, he was just attending a conference abroad with Xun Lian, and there was no interaction between them. Though they were engaged, they were less than strangers except on necessary occasions. There was no hatred between strangers, but between them, there was. Tang Yu stood in the elevator, and only Xiao Ran was beside him. Xiao Ran looked at his CEO carefully and felt that his whole body was tense. Thinking about it, seeing one's little lamb being hugged intimately by someone else could make one think of 10,000 words. Xiao Ran hesitated and said, CEO, why did you take the same flight with Mr. Shen today? If it were in the past, the CEO would have changed the flight in advance. She couldn't understand. If it weren't for the CEO's dark face, she would have thought that the CEO had deliberately arranged for Pei Chi-Chi to see it. Xiao Ran couldn't understand. Chapter 771. Their chief editor was very good at taking advantage of others. She had dared to come to his door and ask for an interview after seeing him once that night. The reason why Tang Yu didn't refuse was also because of Pei Chi-Chi. When the elevator arrived, Xiao Ran looked at him and nodded. Okay, I got it. An expensive black sports car was parked at the exit. Tang Yu sat directly in the driver's seat, while Xiao Ran sat next to him. After fastening his seatbelt, he began to report on the afternoon's mission. Although the long journey was tiring, the big boss had no time to rest. There was no time to rest. Tang Yu listened indifferently as he drove. When he reached the red light in front of him, he slowly stopped the car. On the sidewalk, Pei Chi-Chi and Old Ken were together. Old Ken was carrying a suitcase in each hand, while Pei Chi-Chi was carrying a small bag and following behind him like a little attendant. Although they were walking one after the other, they were indescribably intimate. Xiao Ran also saw them and was about to say something, but Tang Yu had already run the red light and followed them. Xiao Ran was shocked. He wanted to say something, but in the end, he didn't say anything. Tang Yu followed the taxi they had called all the way to an apartment building. Watching them get into an elevator, Tang Yu's face was livid. He had been sure that Pei Chi-Chi and Old Ken didn't have that kind of relationship, but now, he wasn't so sure. Did they live together? Seeing that Tang Yu's fingers had turned white as he held the steering wheel, Xiao Ran hesitated for a moment before saying, Boss, should I go and ask? Tang Yu looked up at the high-rise apartment building, which was more than 20 stories high, and said indifferently, check it out later. He stepped on the accelerator and the car sped away. On the top floor of the 23rd floor, Old Ken stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window with a bottle of Coke in his hand. He grinned as he watched the black sports car drive away. At that moment, Pei Chi-Chi came over from the small apartment across the street, mainly to deliver some food to Old Kansas. She had lived in such a good house for nothing, so she should at least show some filial respect. Old Can's residence was 160 square meters, and the decorations were very stylish. The monthly rent was more than 30,000 yuan. Pei Chi-Chi came in and exclaimed, This is too extravagant, master. She put down her things and jumped twice on the sofa. Old Can turned around with a smile, his eyes deep. You've lived in houses 10 times better than this, silly girl. The smile on Pei Chi-Chi's face disappeared. She looked at Lao Can with a hint of wariness in her eyes. Old Can threw a Coke over and sat on the sofa. He smiled and said, Why? Don't you want to talk about that gigolo? There's nothing to talk about. Pei Chi-Chi opened the can of cola, took a sip, and stood up. I'm going back to sleep for a while. The apartment was managed like a hotel, so there was no need to tidy up. Lao Can threw him a mocking look. Coward. I'm not. Pei Chi-Chi stuck out her tongue. Let's have dinner together tonight. She poked at his kitchen. I like this. Old Can threw a room card to her like a man. Come over if you want to use it. Pei Chi-Chi took it and made a sound, as if she thought of something. Master, Will you bring him over to take pictures? You're such a bad girl. Oldkin scolded jokingly. Pei Chi laughed secretly and went out. But when she closed the door, her smile disappeared. Her mind was filled with the scene of Tang Yu and Shen Lian standing together at the airport. They were together after all. Pei Chi looked down and laughed at herself. What are you thinking, Pei Chi? You're his sister. How could you possibly have a future with him? Chapter 772. Her child was gone, and he was engaged to Shen Lian so soon. Was this the love he had always talked about? She forced herself not to think about it anymore. Although it was difficult, she didn't want to retreat anymore since she had already set foot on this land. On the other side, Tang Yu stood quietly in front of the floor-to-ceiling window. His posture was calm, his appearance was impeccable, and his nobility was compelling. However, only he himself knew that his heart wasn't as calm as it seemed. Xiao Ran pushed the door open and walked in slowly. President, I found it. Tang Yu turned around slightly, and his side profile was handsome. Xiao Ran looked at him. Kim Ming rented 2 apartments, one big and one small. I think they live separately. Although Tang Yu didn't believe that Chi would be with someone else, he was relieved after hearing this. Xiao Ran paused. President, the meeting at Marvel is at 2 in the afternoon. Should we leave? Tang Yu walked to the office chair, picked up his coat, and walked out first. Xiao Ran followed. When they arrived at the Marvel building, they went straight to the conference room. Wang Ziki and Lin Jinrong were already sitting in the conference room. Tang Yu nodded and sat on the seat of honor. Although Lin Jinrong had taken over as the president of Lin Corporation and Wang Ziki was also the vice president of Lin Corporation, Tang Yu already had full control of Marvel. It had nothing to do with Lin Corporation. There was a long silence in the conference room until Tang Yu said, Manager Li? Manager Li nodded and asked someone to bring out the new season's products. In the past 2 years, Marvel's range of electronic products had been expanding, and they had been leading the industry. However, Marvel had always insisted on being themselves and would never use a big star to endorse them. Ever since the Pei Corporation and Marvel had worked together, the Pei Corporation had been the agent for Marvel's promotion. The former employee of the Pei Corporation, Dink, had already risen in value. However, no matter how much the outside world offered him, he couldn't be poached away. Over the past year, the Pei family had become more and more mysterious. The outside world could not see the specific situation of the Pei family. It was as if there was a hard wall blocking their view. The latest product was tightly packed and pushed in. Manager Li personally opened the packaging to reveal the real product inside. This was also the first appearance of this generation of electronic products. This is our Marvel's newest generation robot, Robot Number 7, Manager Li said proudly. Number 7? Was it Pei Chi's idea? Everyone was silently thinking that this information was much more attractive than the robot itself. Manager Li was an IT man. He was very honest, and his voice was loud and clear. Once this robot enters the market, it will overturn everyone's previous impression of robots. At this time, the others turned their attention to the robot. In fact, her appearance was quite ordinary. It was the appearance of a well-behaved little maid, but it was quite realistic. Robot Number 7 has as many bones as we humans do, and it even has artificial organs. She will react differently depending on your emotions. Manager Li stepped forward and pressed a button. For example, if I kiss her now, what will she do if we have no feelings for each other? Manager Li was old, but he really had no integrity for the sake of his career. He kissed her just like that. Chapter 773. Because the surface of the robot was made of imitation leather, its structure was not like cold metal, so it didn't hurt much. Manager Li was a little dumbfounded after being slapped in the face. There was no such thing in the program. How could this robot hit its owner? He looked at his beloved general and then at Tang Yu. Theo, there must be a mistake. No. Tang Yu's voice was calm. I was the one who added this program. Robot Number 7 is a full simulation robot. I wanted the most direct reaction. Manager Li didn't quite agree with this, but because of Tang Yu's authority, he didn't dare to say anything. He rubbed his nose and sat down. Tang Yu walked in front of number 7 and touched number 7's face with his slender fingers. Number 7's voice was weak. "Let go of me." Lin Jinrong, who was sitting next to him, said calmly, "I object to the release of this robot." Tang Yu's fingers paused, and he patted number 7 lightly. Number 7 immediately rubbed his face against his fingers. Tang Yu then retracted his fingers and looked at Lin Jinrong. "Why?" Lin Jinrong was expressionless. This robot has a tendency to tempt people into committing crimes, because it made people think of some kind of doll. Tang Yu said calmly, "So, we made robot number 7 very ugly but cute. It would never make people think of something like that." Lin Jinrong walked over slowly and touched number 7's face with his fingers. Number 7 immediately turned his head away arrogantly and ignored him. Lin Jinrong looked at him for a long time before asking softly, "Is it because she rejects everyone except you?" Tang Yu tilted his head and smiled. "No, it's just because she is familiar with me. We met a few times during the development, didn't we?" Number 7 nodded. Lin Jinrong's eyes were cold, and he didn't say anything else. But after the meeting, Lin Jinrong stayed. Lin Jinrong was no longer the Lin Jinrong of the past. He had changed a lot in the past year. He had matured a lot. He wore a three-piece suit, which accentuated his slender and youthful body. His slightly artistic hair was now neatly trimmed, and he looked like an elite, just like Tang Yu from a few years ago. Xiao Ran closed the door, leaving only Lin Jinrong and Tang Yu standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling window. Lin Jinrong passed a cigarette to Tang Yu and lit one for himself. After taking a long drag, he said, "Brother Tang Yu, she's back." Tang Yu's fingers trembled. He turned his head and looked at Lin Jinrong quietly. From his actions, Lin Jinrong got what he wanted to know. He took a long drag on his cigarette and sneered. "You know?" Tang Yu didn't say anything. He just looked at Lin Jinrong. He understood Jinrong. Jinrong definitely had something to say, and it was very important to him. "Brother Tang Yu." Lin Jinrong's voice was filled with helplessness. "I still love her." Even though he had expected it, Tang Yu's body still trembled. He walked in front of No. 7 and turned off the robot's power switch. Then, he said softly, "And then?" Lin Jinrong turned and looked in Tang Yu's direction. After a long time, he said softly, "If you don't object, I want to be with her." Tang Yu's expression froze. His gaze fell on Lin Jinrong's face, and he could shake a few ice beads at any time. Chapter 774. Tang Yu's voice was soft. "Jinrong, what if I object?" "Even if you object, I will insist on being with her." Lin Jinrong's face was firm. "Unless you break off the engagement with Shunlian now." Tang Yu's pupils contracted, and he glared at him. Lin Jinrong chuckled. "You can't do it? Brother Tang Yu, since you don't want her, why are you pestering her?" Tang Yu narrowed his eyes. "Jinrong, are you following me?" Lin Jinrong lifted his chin slightly, his gaze cold. He and Tang Yu were related by blood. Sometimes, they really looked alike from certain angles. "Are you afraid that I will find out that you kissed her in City H? Or that you had sex with her when she was drunk?" Lin Jinrong said as he threw a punch at him. It was a full-force punch. Tang Yu took a few steps back from the sudden punch, and his body hit the conference table behind him. Lin Jinrong did not stop there. He went forward and threw another punch. This time, Tang Yu caught his punch and said in a low voice, "Jinrong." Lin Jinrong's gaze was cold. "Why? You don't dare to fight back? Are you feeling guilty? If you don't want her, why do you want to hurt her again?" Lin Jinrong's handsome face was almost distorted. Tang Yu waved his fist away, and a cold smile appeared on his lips. "Jinrong, don't get involved between us." Because he had never wanted Chi-Chi. How could he not want Chi-Chi? Between you and her? Shouldn't it be between you and Xinlian now? Lin Jinrong punched him again. "Tell me, where is Chi-Chi's child?" "She was pregnant with your child, and the child was miscarried. Then, you got engaged to Xinlian. Did I overestimate your love for her, or did you overestimate your love for her?" There was a hint of bitterness in the corner of Tang Yu's mouth. The reason why he didn't fight back was, Jinrong looked good but was useless. He looked good, but in fact, he couldn't take a beating. He didn't want to beat him into a cripple or turn him into a vegetable again. He sat down and lit the half-smoked cigarette. After taking a long drag, he said indifferently, "As long as she's willing to be with you, I won't object." Lin Jinrong was stunned. He loved Qiqi, and he had not forgotten her. But today, he was doing this for Qiqi. If Tang Yu wanted to let go of everything, then he would fulfill his wish. But now, Tang Yu said such a thing. Lin Jinrong was completely stunned. Tang Yu fiercely finished half of his cigarette, put it out, and got up. When they reached the door, Lin Jinrong asked softly, "Are you sure?" Tang Yu placed his hand on the doorknob and closed his eyes. "Of course. But Jinrong, I won't let you have such a chance." He opened the door and walked out. Lin Jinrong was stunned for a moment and then kicked a chair hard. The chair fell heavily on the floor, and his leg cramped up. It hurt so much. However, he kicked it again, and it hurt even more. Lin Jinrong walked out of Marvel. Wang Ziqi's car was still downstairs. He leaned against the white sports car and smiled faintly. "Do you need me to give you a ride?" It was obvious that their melancholic comic prince's leg was hurting again, and he was walking unnaturally. Lin Jinrong didn't refuse and got into Wang Ziqi's white Audi. Wang Ziqi looked at the person beside him and smiled faintly. "Is it because of boss pay?" Chapter 775. Lin Jinrong rested his elbow on the car window and looked at the traffic outside. Suddenly, he said, "I want to get her back." Prince Qi braked and stopped the car. There was a red light in front of him. He looked at the flickering red light, and a warm feeling rose in his eyes. No one had ever known that he had feelings for Pei Qiqi. Perhaps it had always been there, but he had purposely faded it. At this moment, he was a little envious of Jinrong. At least, he dared to say that he wanted Tang Yu's woman. Before he started the car again, Prince Qi said calmly, "Jinrong, I'll give you a piece of advice. Give up. If Tang Yu really wanted to marry Xinlian, he would have done it long ago. Why wait until now?" Furthermore, even a blind man could tell what robot number 7 was trying to convey. Lin Jinrong smiled softly. It was a bitter smile. "If I could, I want it too." But as long as there was a glimmer of hope, he would not give up. Prince Qi didn't say anything else. In the CEO's office at Marvel, Xiao Ran choked when she opened the door. The big room was filled with the smell of smoke, and Tang Yu was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window smoking. She walked over and saw the scar at the corner of his mouth. Xiao Ran sighed softly and said in a low voice, "CEO, do you want me to bring the first aid kit over?" Tang Yu turned around. "It's okay." He paused for a moment before asking Xiao Ran, "Did Jinrong drive himself?" Xiao Ran nodded. "I saw him get into Vice President Wang's car." Tang Yu was relieved. He continued to stand and finish smoking. Then he suddenly said, "Jinrong told me that he wants to be with Qiqi." Xiao Ran was stunned. Firstly, she didn't expect Lin Jinrong to be so direct. Secondly, she didn't expect the CEO to tell her such a thing. Tang Yu's expression was bitter as he said, "I agree." God knew how unwilling he was, but he had to give up. That way, Qiqi would be safe, and Xinlian would be less vigilant. However, he did not know if she would understand what he was doing in the future. Xiao Ran was also a little sad. Over the past year or so, she was the only one who could see Tang Yu's pain. She thought that no matter what happened, the president had never given up on Pei Qiqi. He must have his own difficulties. She did not speak for a long time. Tang Yu looked up and laughed at himself. In the following 2 days, Tang Yu flew to the United States for a week. This week, Pei Qiqi contacted Xiao Ran no less than 3 times because she wanted to interview Tang Yu. This task was given to Pei Qiqi by the chief editor on her first day of work. Pei Qiqi refused. But her refusal was ineffective because she was no match for the chief editor. The chief editor used all kinds of threats and temptations, and Pei Qiqi was defeated. "I only have one condition, and that is to let Old can take the photos." Pei Chi pursed her lips. No matter how stupid she was, she could understand the chief editor's thoughts. She was a photographer, so she did not know anything about interviews, but the chief editor threw such a difficult task to her. This is not a problem. You just have to convince old Kansas. After thinking about it, the chief editor was still worried. Our agency forbids office romance. You and old Can should restrain yourselves. Pei Chi walked to the door and turned back. But old Can and I have already started. At this time, old Can happened to come in and heard her. He patted her head. Little girl, I don't like you. Hence, she stood together with him and looked into the distance. Master, just ask me if I still want to be with him, okay? Old Can's expression softened. He reached out to stroke her hair and smiled. So do you still want to be with him? Pei Chi shook her head vigorously. No. She looked up at old Kansas. I really don't want to be with him. She didn't dare to anymore. Chapter 777. Oldkin smiled and said, Why don't you find someone to fall in love with? Do you think I'm suitable? It's been a long time since I've had a private job. Pei Chi sadness was destroyed by old Kansas. She held onto the railing of the rooftop and looked at the huge buildings in the distance. The words, Shangyuan Corporation, shone brightly under the sun. She suddenly felt less afraid. She turned around and smiled at old Kansas. Let me try. If you can't do it, I'll allow you to come back to my arms and cry. Old King grinned, revealing his white teeth. Pei Chi's eyes lit up, and a sense of pride rose in his heart. However, this pride was shattered by reality. She wanted to meet Tang Yu, but Tang Yu wasn't there. Xiao Ran received her instead. Pei Chi didn't go up and directly spoke in the lobby. The people who came and went looked at her, surprised and shocked. Everyone in Shangyuan Corporation knew Pei Chi and knew that she and Tang Yu had divorced. At that time, she had been pregnant for a few months, but the child was gone. Now, Pei Chi was very different. She wore ordinary clothes and was thinner than before, but she was still beautiful. Although thin, she gave off a sunny vibe. In short, she was very different. Beside her was a bearded, long-legged Appa. He was very tall and had very long legs. They were slender and straight, and also very muscular. It was easy to imagine that a certain part of his body was also CZ. Oldkin leaned against the front desk and smoked, ignoring the rule that smoking was not allowed in Shangyuan Corporation. Xiao Ran only glanced at him. She knew that Old Can was Chi-Chi's mentor, and they had a good relationship. She was relieved to see him. Although this man looked rough, his eyes were very warm, and he treated Chi-Chi like a mother hen protecting her chick. It was no wonder that the president trusted Chi-Chi with such a man. Xiao Ran smiled faintly. The president will be back in a week. I'll inform you then. Okay? She looked at Chi-Chi without blinking. At this moment, Xiao Ran realized that he missed Chi-Chi very much. However, she couldn't be close friends with Pei Chi because she was Tang Yu's secretary. Pei Chi nodded. All right. She looked at old Kansas. Let's go first. Lao Can followed behind her leisurely. Although he looked normal and ordinary, his posture made it seem like he was Pei Chi-Chi's boyfriend. All of Shang Yuan's employees were in an uproar. Breaking news. Extra. Pei Chi had returned. The former CEO's wife had returned, along with her beastly boyfriend. Definitely not as rich as the CEO. But looking at his physique, he was definitely better than the CEO in some aspects. For example, the size. For example, durability. During the week that Tang Yu wasn't around, this rumor spread like wildfire. Everyone thought that the CEO was going to cry himself to sleep in the toilet. A week later, Tang Yu returned to be city. As soon as he entered the office, Xiao Ran reported, President, someone from Beauty Magazine came over. I made an appointment with her for this Wednesday. Is there a problem? Tang Yu sat down with his tie in hand. His slender and good-looking fingers supported his forehead as he said lightly, "Let her come over and arrange an all-day meeting for that day." Xiao Ran was a little stunned. Wasn't he making them wait for nothing? Tang Yu looked up. "Is there a problem?" Xiao Ran shook his head and suddenly asked, "President, did you hear the rumor in the company?" Tang Yu sneered. "Is it about me not being as good as Pei Chi-Chi's new boyfriend in some aspects?" Xiao Ran did not say a word. Fine. Pei Chi-Chi was obviously being retaliated against, but the CEO was so childish. Chapter 778. Because of Tang Yu's instructions, when Pei Chi-Chi appeared at Shangyuan again, Xiao Ran said apologetically, "The CEO is in a meeting." Pei Chi-Chi was holding the interview script in her hand. "Shall we come again next time?" Xiao Ran looked at her, then at Old Can, who was beside her, and nodded. "Okay then." Pei Chi-Chi did not say anything else and walked out with Old Kansas. Old Can couldn't help it after a while. "Don't you think it's strange?" As a man, he was quite familiar with men's routines, especially these business elites, who love to be mysterious. Pei Chi-Chi glanced at Old Kansas. "What's strange about it?" "It's better not to see him." Pei Chi-Chi smiled and said, "Then let me treat you to a cup of coffee. After that, you can look for those rich ladies of yours and see if they have any private jobs. You can't leave them empty." Old Can ruffled her hair. Miser. He was tall, strong, and rough. Pei Chi-Chi was like a little toy being rubbed by him. Although it was a beauty and a beast, it was quite harmonious. Pei Chi-Chi did not care about how others looked at her, but Old Can looked ahead and coughed lightly. "I might not be able to have coffee." Old Can moved his chin and pointed ahead. Pei Chi-Chi looked up and saw the person walking in from the entrance of Shangyuan Academy. Jinrong. Pei Chi-Chi's gaze was a little stunned as she looked at Lin Jinrong. He was wearing a light gray woolen suit and looked much more mature. At this moment, Lin Jinrong's gaze also fell on Pei Chi-Chi. Old Can consciously took all the bags away and shrugged. "You guys talk." With that, he said in a voice that Lin Jinrong could hear, "Pei Chi-Chi, you're really capable. There are quite a lot of old people. Clean them all up for me." Pei Chi-Chi watched him leave, speechless. After Old Can left, only the handsome man and beautiful woman were left at the scene. The receptionist was also secretly watching. Was there any drama in the rich and powerful? The receptionist secretly sent a message to inform Xiao Ran that President Lin was now with Pei Chi-Chi. After reading it, Xiao Ran thought for a while and went to look for Tang Yu. He knocked on the door and cleared his throat. "President Lin is here. He's in the lobby now. Do you want to see him?" Tang Yu frowned and looked at Xiao Ran. They had worked together for many years, so there was a tacit understanding between them. Tang Yu immediately flipped through the documents in front of him. He lowered his eyes and said faintly, "I'm free." Jinrong may not be free at this time. Xiao Ran smiled. He knew what he meant and left. Sigh. He looked calm on the surface, but his heart was probably overturned with jealousy. In the lobby on the first floor, Lin Jinrong put one hand in his pocket and looked at Pei Chi-Chi. "Do you have time for a cup of coffee?" This was the girl he had liked for many years. After they had gone through so much, after reuniting after so many years, he could finally ask her calmly if they could have a cup of coffee together. Pei Chi-Chi looked at him. After a long time, she smiled softly. Of course. He chose a cafe on a Golden Street opposite the Shangyuan Corporation. The environment was very good, and it was as quiet as usual. After Pei Chi-Chi sat down, the waitress came over. The young girl was a little surprised to see her. Then, she was pleasantly surprised. "Miss Pei, I haven't seen you in a long time." Pei Chi-Chi nodded lightly. "2 lattes." She looked at Lin Jinrong. "How is it?" Lin Jinrong smiled, indicating that he didn't mind. Pei Chi-Chi's lips trembled slightly. There was once someone who said the same thing to her. He had also said, "Chi-Chi, I only want you to be happy." But was she happy? No, she was not happy. The wound in her heart had long festered over time. She didn't want it to heal, so she gave up on treatment. Finally, she looked up at him and said, "Jinrong, I'm fine now." Lin Jinrong frowned. He could only watch helplessly as she got into someone else's car. Pei Chi walked up to Old Kansas. Old Can put a safety helmet on her head and buckled it. "Hold on tight." With one arm, he hugged Pei Chi behind him. When the motorcycle leaned forward, she instinctively held on tight. Old King grinned. "Let's go." The flashy motorcycle sped away with a loud roar. Lin Jinrong stood there and smiled faintly. His smile was a little bitter. On the other side, Pei Chi was hugging Old Kansas. As the wind blew past her ears, Pei Chi asked loudly, "Old Can, is this how you usually pick up girls?" You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.